Virtual Genealogy Fair. At our second lecture today, Rebecca Sharp will be our speaker, and she will be talking about Introduction to Genealogy, Civilian. This lecture will provide tips for beginning your genealogical research in federal records. Topics covered include census and immigration records. Rebecca Sharp is an archive specialist in the Research Support Branch in the Customer Services Division at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. She specializes in federal records of genealogical interest. She graduated with departmental honors in history from McDaniel College, which was established as Western Maryland College. Rebecca?
Thank you, Nancy. As Nancy mentioned, my name is Rebecca Sharp, and I work at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Today and tomorrow, you will be meeting a number of archive specialists and archivists who work at the National Archives throughout the nation. And we work in reference, which means that we answer questions, whether you come in on site to visit us, or if you call, email, or attend one of these lectures such as today. This presentation is geared towards beginners, but if you're an experienced researcher, it may have some refresher information that can help you with your research. Up on the screen, you see a picture of the National Archives building, the microfilm research room. And what we don't want is for you to feel like you are surrounded by a sea of microfilm. So the first thing to keep in mind is that our staff is always here to help you. If you have a question, do not hesitate to ask us. Today I will be talking to you about records held at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., but also keep in mind that your regions may also hold some of these microfilm publications that I'm covering. You can also view the digital copies of records free of charge from any National Archives research facility. We have research facilities in Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Georgia, Maryland, New York, Massachusetts, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington, D.C., and Washington State. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind when you're coming to visit us is that the more preparation you do, the more information you will find. So some things you can do to prepare include to read books about genealogy. You can check with your local librarian and see what they have in their holdings, and they can get some books for you via interlibrary loan. You may consider joining a genealogical society, and you may also attend lectures and genealogical conferences, including local conferences, as well as those on the national level, such as this virtual genealogy fair, the Federation of Genealogical Societies, and the National Genealogical Society also have national conferences. And the number one rule of thumb when you're doing your genealogical research is to start with what you know and work your way backward. That way you ensure that you are finding not just people that have the names of your ancestors, but they are actually your ancestors. You will want to take a look to see what kind of family documents you have and record the full names, important dates such as birth, marriage, and death, and residences of your relatives. And of course, organize your information. The National Archives has a lot of federal records, but there are also records that are at the state and local level that we do not have. These include vital records such as birth, marriage, divorce, and death records, published family histories in newspapers. We have the records at the National Archives that you can use to write your own family histories. But if you're looking for a published family history or newspapers, the Library of Congress is the largest depository in the DC area. Up on the screen now, there's a web shot of the National Archives main page, and I've circled in red the genealogist link. That is the place that you can go to start your research. And I will not spend a lot of time on the web page because a little bit later today, Nancy Wing will be giving you a step-by-step tutorial of the National Archives website. Today I will cover both census and passenger arrival records. Those are two of the most frequently used records that genealogists take a look at in terms of civilian records when they first come through our doors. In terms of census records, we have them from 1790 through 1940. They were taken every 10 years, and they are under privacy for 72 years. They are arranged by year, state, and then by county. And of course, like I mentioned before, you want to start with the most recent census and work your way backward. And one thing you'll notice too today as we go through these different records is over time, records start to record more and more information about individuals. From 1790 to 1840, that lists the heads of the household, but the information about the other members is statistical in nature, and I'll show you what I mean on the next slide. Here's an 1840 census example from Mifflin County, Pennsylvania. And the purple arrow is pointing towards Samuel Yoder. He is the head of the household, but the information about the other residents of that household are statistical in nature, so you have them by age groupings. For instance, you have a male, two males, 10 and under the age of 15, one female, 5 and under 10, for example. These early census records are often 2 pages, so here is the second page of that record. And another common theme that you will find as you do your research is there are discrepancies in the records. So there can be discrepancies about date of birth, for instance, and in this case, it tallies up the total number of people in the household. If you count all the people on the other page, you get a total of 8. But this one says that there are 7 people in the household. We'll move on to the next grouping, which is 1850 to 1870. That lists all the members of the household, but you still do not know how they're related to one another. So you might get people that are in an extended family. You may get servants. You just will not necessarily know everyone. This is also the census in 1850 and 1860 where we have separate free and slave schedules. And I have examples of both to show you a little bit later. Up on the screen, we have an 1860 slave schedule for Fauquier County, Virginia. The purple arrow is pointing at Matilda L.A. Chapman. It indicates that she owns 5 slaves, 1 adult, and 4 children. Now, typically, slave schedules list the name of the slaveholder, but they do not list the names of the slaves. In terms of the slaves, the information is statistical in nature, such as their age, their sex, their color, and any other disabilities. Now, this example that's up on the screen is unusual in a number of ways. A lot of times, if someone makes it to about the age of 100, you may have the name of a slave listed. And that is the case. On the left-hand side, you have, under Alexander Chapman, it says, Uncle Jarrett Briggs died in the family 1852. He was 112 years old, and he remembered Lord Cornwallis and the taking of Yorktown, was a faithful and highly respectable servant. You also, on the left-hand side, have a notation of twins. So here's one of my favorite examples. This is the 1860 census, and it was taken in the District of Columbia. And records often give us something that we can chuckle about from time to time. In this particular case where you have that purple arrow, you have an individual by the name of William. The last name could be Young. It's a little hard to tell what the spelling is. The handwriting is really difficult to read. The irony of this situation is that the individual is a teacher of penmanship. Unfortunately, the census taker did not have very legible handwriting. The other thing to keep in mind is to stay open-minded when you're doing your research. Today, I'll show you an example where, with the red box, you see the women's occupation is listed as fancy women. So you never know what you might come across. You'll find that a little bit later on throughout the fair, especially there's a lecture about penitentiary records. Sometimes people that lived interesting lives leave behind more documents. So if we move on to the 1880 to the 1940 grouping, we get more information like I promised before. So now we have the relationships to the head of the household, citizenship information, including the year of immigration and the naturalization status. You will find annotations with abbreviations such as NA for naturalized, PA for papers filed, and AL for alien. These give you an idea or a snapshot of approximately when a person became a U.S. citizen. So if in 1910 you see an alien, by 1920 you see that they've naturalized, you know that sometime in that 10-year window they became a U.S. citizen. So that is the other thing that is really important about both census and passenger arrival records. They give hints that may lead you to other documents. They are also arranged by enumeration districts. An enumeration district, or an ED, is the area that one census taker could cover during the allotted census time. If they were covering a city, it could be a couple of blocks. If they were out in the country, it could be the entire county. Soundex is a phonetic indexing system that is based on the way a last name sounds, and it helps you with spelling variations. For instance, the name Smith or Smythe will be grouped together within that code. That's the other thing that I want you to keep in mind when you're doing any kind of research, is that there can be a lot of different spelling variations, so your ancestor's name may not be spelled the way that you expect it to be. In terms of the 1890 census, there was a fire that destroyed most of the records. Only about 1% of those schedules survive. Up on the screen, this is the first record that I'm showing you that is not a Bureau of the Census record. This is a record that can be used as a census substitute. It was taken by the Veterans Administration, and it was to enumerate Union pensioners. Now, that being said, there are still some exceptions. You will also find Confederate War of 1812 and Mexican War veterans on occasion. For this particular 1890 veteran census, the schedules from Alabama through the first half of Kentucky have not survived. Now, up on the screen, we have the purple arrow pointing at William Finn. It notes that he served in the 1st Engineers, Company J, enlisted in June of 1862. And then if you look a little further at the bottom, there's additional information about Mr. Finn. It notes that his disability was incurred during service, and it was chronic tremble. This example is also one of these exceptions to the rules. If you look up here at the top of the document, there is something that's crossed out, but you can still read the information. It relates to a Moses R. Caldwell, and at the bottom there's information about his service that indicates that he was discharged during the Mexican War. So this is one of these oops moments where if this was your ancestor, that's a very good thing because you find additional information that's not even supposed to be on this record. The most recent record that is in the National Archives holding is the 1940 census. It was released on April 2nd, 2012, and it was the first digital release. If you go to the URL that I have up on the slide, that will take you to the research page, and there are a number of tips on that page, including videos, finding aids, especially one that you want to pay special attention to is the instructions to the enumerators. If you see the different column headings and you wonder how the enumerator was supposed to answer that, you could download those instructions and see what the different abbreviations are and the different categories. Now, of course, that goes without saying that sometimes the enumerators did not follow instructions. And up on the screen is a case where the enumerator did not follow instructions, and it's a good thing. This is my ancestor with that purple arrow. It's the Sharp family in Deerfield Township, Steele County, Minnesota. Now, what you notice on here is there are some predetermined areas at random where there are supplemental questions. So there's one here for my family member. There's another one here for another family member. So when that happens, you get additional information about the individual on that line. In this case, it was supposed to give the place of birth of the individual's parents, but in the case of my ancestor, it listed the names of her parents. So if that's something that you didn't have, that's a valuable piece of information. And it also includes the maiden name of her mother, which is Davidson. In terms of availability, census records are widely available. They are on microfilm at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. And our regional archives also have select film. You would want to check with them before you visit them. Family search centers are another resource for census research. And they are also available online at Ancestry.com, HeritageQuestOnline.com, and partial census records are on Fold3.com. As I mentioned before, these are subscription-based websites that you can view for free from any of our research rooms. And you can also mail order census records from the National Archives for a fee by visiting our website. So we'll move on to passenger arrival records. There are two different groupings. From 1820 to 1890, those records were kept by the U.S. Customs Service. And as a general rule, the National Archives has passenger arrival records beginning in 1820. One of the exceptions was one of the earliest ports, which is Philadelphia in 1800. We also have records from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS for short, from 1891 to 1957. And as I mentioned earlier, in these records, the same rule applies. With the really early passenger arrival records, there is very little information. When you get into the 1920s, there is a lot of information. Usually there's 2 pages that relate to one individual. And then when you get to about the 1950s, then that information drops off again. And I'll show you an example of each type of these records as we move through the presentation. The National Archives has records for every major port, including Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Boston, New Orleans, and San Francisco. For a complete listing of the different ports that we have in our holdings, you can visit the National Archives website under the research topics. I gave you a handout on the virtual genealogy webpage that will take you to some of these pages. We also have border crossing records for St. Albans, which are Canadian border crossings, as well as Mexican border crossings. Now, in terms of the information you can find, all passenger arrival records give you the name of the vessel, the name of the ship's master, the ports and arrival and embarkation, date of departure, and the date of arrival. The early to mid-19th century records have minimal information, including the name of the individual, their age, their occupation, their country of origin, and their destination. So let's take a look at one of those early records. Up on the screen right now, you have the brig Experiment arriving at the port of Philadelphia on June 27, 1809. The upper portion has cargo listed in quite a bit of detail. Some of that cargo includes 14 boxes of linen, 1 chest of glass, and 1 box of sealing wax. If you look a little closer at the manifest, down in this portion, this is where you have the passengers that are listed. We have a Henry Voigt and his wife and 3 children, and the only information that it gives about them is that they are carrying 1 trunk and bags of bedding. We move on to an 1886 example, and you can see that there is a lot more information. Now we're using pre-printed forms. And up here we have a died on voyage category. So that means that people were passing away during travel frequently enough for there to be a need for that to be part of the pre-printed form. On this page we have a 17-year-old Mary Callahan, who is Irish. She's a domestic servant going to Chicago, and she traveled in female steerage. And at the bottom of the manifest, we also have 2 infants. The record notes that their last name is either Howson or Paulson. They are Pete and Maria. They were born at sea on August 10th, 1886. Maria died on August 17th, 1886, and Pete passed away on August 12th, 1886. And they more than likely had partial or complete loss of consciousness, probably due to heart problems in this particular case. Now, as we move on to some of the later records, these are late 19th century to the 20th century records, you can see that we get a tremendous amount of information about the passengers, including their name, the names of any traveling companions, their age and personal description, their occupation, their last residence, the name and address of the relatives that they're going to join in the U.S., whether they can read or write, whether they're a polygamist or an anarchist, and the amount of money they are carrying. Up on the screen we have an example. It's a March 27, 1923 arrival at the Port of New York aboard the SS Majestic. The purple arrow is pointing at Seth Van Slars, and you can notice throughout the naturalization column there are all these numbers. They just carry through down through this column. This is a case where you have something that might lead to additional documentation. In this case, it is a passport number. So in the case of Seth Van Slars, we can take that information and find a passport application. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. has passport applications issued all the way up to March 31st, 1925. So when we look for that passport application, we find that Seth is more than likely a nickname that was listed on a passenger manifest because the passport needed to have that legal name. So his legal name is Sidney Van Slars. We get his date of birth, information about his father's immigration information. He arrived in the U.S. in 1895. He is planning to travel all over the world, including Spain, Algeria, Italy, Egypt, France, and the British Isles. Beginning on December 21st, 1914, passport applications include photographs. So in this particular case, we have Seth Van Slars' photograph, as well as an affidavit from his mother. When they have problems finding birth documentation, often a parent or a relative or the midwife may verify that they witnessed the birth. And that's the case with Sidney Van Slars. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the passenger arrival records from the 1950s have very little information about the passenger. We have a 1953 arrival at the Port of New York on the SS New Amsterdam. Up here we have 2 individuals with the last name Alexander. We know that they're related to each other, but we don't know exactly how. We do have their passport number, and it's the same number. So that indicates that they're either married to one another or perhaps father and daughter. We just don't know all the information. Now, after March 31st, 1925, you could go ahead and order the passport application, but it's still in the custody of the Department of State. So that would be a way that you could find out additional information about these individuals and determine whether or not they are your ancestors. The only other information that it gives is the type of luggage that they are carrying on their person during their trip. We move on to border crossings, and they're very similar to the passenger manifest that you saw earlier, but these cards are for one single individual. In this case, we have a card for Daniel Bratton, and it notes that he crossed at a toll bridge. It also notes that he lived in the U.S. previously. He lived in San Antonio, Texas between 1914 and 1919, and he's returning to the U.S. to reside. He's employed at the State Theater. He's 5'9" tall with a dark complexion and brown eyes. Now again, this raises the question, how can you access passenger arrival records? There's several different ways. You can visit the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., and also our regional archives have select ports, so please do check with them before you visit them. Family search centers are also another source for passenger arrival research, and you can view them online through Ancestry.com by subscription or for free from any of our research facilities. ellisisland.org and castlegarden.org are also searchable databases that you can use from the comfort of your home. And you always have the option of filling out a mail order form by going to the archives.gov website and ordering online or downloading an NATF form 81. Now, with that being said, I don't want to take away from your research time. I want to invite you all to come and visit us at the National Archives, whether you're close to DC or if you want to visit us at one of our regions. We are here to answer your questions. With that being said, this concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
So much for your presentation, Rebecca. We do have 2 questions. The first one is pretty generic. It says, I know there are delayed birth certificates. Do delayed death certificates exist? Delayed death certificates.
That's something that you would want to check on the state level with the Bureau of Vital Statistics and see if they have that for the particular state that you're researching. I know one thing that we have here is a birth substitute. As far as birth certificates, we do not have those vital records, but a lot of times if someone was born without birth documentation, let's say in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s, we can certify a census record.
The second question's more specific. You had talked earlier about the Aldridge gals.
Yes.
Their question is, I have marriages in Stamford, Connecticut. How do I find these Aldridge gals?
So you're looking for marriage records, or does it?
Marriage records. They say they have marriages in Stamford, Connecticut, Vermont.
Okay. Depending on when those records that you're looking for, they could either be at the State Bureau of Vital Records, or if it's before that, you could also check. Did you say Vermont? You could try the Vermont Historical Society. You could also try the State Archives and see when if they have any indexes to vital records that predate what the Bureau of Vital Records has in their holdings.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have one last question. I think this is an easy one. Is Wi-Fi available at the archive so I can just bring my tablet without all of the paper?
Absolutely. We have Wi-Fi in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and you can hook up to that from any of our research rooms. And also at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, they also have Wi-Fi access. Well, I thank everyone for attending this lecture, and please tune in later for some other presentations. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send us an email at inquire, N as in Nancy, QUIRE at N as in Nancy, ARA.gov. That is inquire@nara.gov. Thank you.